Hi there everybody and welcome to this week's episode of Art of Procurement with me, Philip Eidson. So when it comes to complex products and services, I've yet to see a long-term contract that really remains in full alignment with both the buyer and the seller's goals throughout the entirety of the contract, especially when you're looking at 3, 5, sometimes I've been involved in 7+ year contracts. So what can we do to keep both parties aligned, maximizing the impact of the relationship while mitigating against expensive and damaging renegotiations? They often lead to a lack of trust or lost trust and potentially, in a worst case scenario, legal action. Well, I'm joined on the podcast today by Kate Witasek. And Kate is the founder and architect of the Vested Outsourcing Framework, and she's also part of the Faculty of Graduate and Executive Education at the University of Tennessee. So one of the core pillars of the success of Vested has been the use of a standing neutral. It's a neutral third party that's appointed by both sides to act as an independent governance lead that proactively helps the buyer and the seller stay aligned and helps mediate and arbitrate any bumps that they may have along the way. Well, Kate has co-authored a white paper published in February 2020 that lays out the what, the when, the how of leveraging a standing neutral. And so in today's conversation, Kate and I explore the role of a standing neutral and how procurement leaders can leverage this tool to maximize the outcomes achieved from their most complex deals. Now, at Art of Procurement, we're really proud to be hosting this white paper in our newly built resource center. So if you are interested in what Kate has to say, it's piqued your interest, you'd like to know a little bit more, you can just go over to our resource center to download a copy. And that's just at artofprocurement.com/resources. That's artofprocurement.com/resources, and you'll just see a white paper section right there. All right, let's go into the interview with Kate. And so in my first question, I asked Kate if she could just expand upon what exactly is a standing neutral.
Well, that's a great question because a lot of people don't realize what a standing neutral is. So a standing neutral is a form of alternative dispute resolution, or an ADR technique. And what it does is it brings that neutral aspect. So think about a mediator or an arbitrator. Mm-hmm. We typically bring those guys in when you're really unhappy, kind of after the fact, and you're trying to resolve a conflict.
Yeah.
Well, a standing neutral is that neutral role, but they're actually brought in way earlier. They're actually part of your governance structure. So when you have QBRs, when you have an issue resolution log, and it's taking you more than a week or, whatever your time frame is you want to decide on, you're going to have that standing neutral who's part of your team, right? So they're appended to you. They are part of you, versus this, oh my gosh, I'm in conflict. Mm-hmm. I need my mediator or arbitrator, and you're mad. You brought in the lawyers already.
So when would it be appropriate to have one? Is there a certain type of supplier relationship where it makes more sense to have, a proactive mediator to say a standing neutral, or would you advise this for any commercial relationship?
Well, one of the things that we teach, and this is a different podcast that you had, was sourcing as a continuum, right? Yeah. So you go all the way from basic, buying something on Amazon to really complex investment-based joint ventures. So you want to use a standing neutral when you have something more complex. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense for a basic type provider or approved provider. But those, especially if you're in a performance-based type of an agreement, a large outsourcing agreement, any vested type relationship where you're very integrated between the parties, or a joint venture, right? Because you're still, two different companies coming together, and you may not always see eye to eye on things. And it really is a great way to just embed that neutral view right into the governance structure, and it solves so many problems so much more efficiently.
Yeah, so you talk about solving problems. As you think about standing neutral, is that just is it a person, or is the process, or perhaps different elements of a QBR, for example, that may not exist without them? Are they bringing more than being a person to ensure that the relationship is staying on track? It's actually thinking differently about how you manage that relationship.
That's correct. Yeah. So it is very proactive in nature. It's upfront in nature. And it does help you work through issues if you do have issues. So that's what, it's one of the key roles that they have. But there's not a set way. It's really interesting in the white paper that we just released by the University of Tennessee, we profile a dozen different examples of how organizations are effectively using a standing neutral. Mm-hmm. And it is more of a process, right? So you mentioned the process. It is a process to incorporate a third opinion to help you be more effective and efficient in your relationship. But sometimes it's not just a person. In the construction industry, it's actually three people, right? So you have what's called a dispute review board. And it's kind of weird, right? I don't even like the name dispute review board because it's like, oh, it's a dispute, I'll bring them in. But they actually sit in, they're a regular part of your team. They come to your office. And when you've got these construction review projects, usually they're monthly, sometimes they're weekly, right? But you have a cadence for your governance on these big, huge construction projects. They come to you and they are part of the team and they look through your issues. And if you're, well, I don't know, should we do this? Should we do this? I think in construction, you've got lots of different opinions on things, right? Between the designers and the architects and the builders. Yeah. And they're right there real time part of the team. And it's been very successful in the construction industry. And that's one of the data points that we look at is how successful this has been when applied. Why aren't we applying these in more mainstream commercial relationships, especially these large types of outsourcing deals?
So who would bring in a standing neutral? Is it something that both parties would agree is kind of necessary as part of the structure of a contract or relationship, and then they're ultimately sharing the cost of that? Is it typically one side comes in and says, hey, I think this will be a great idea and sells the concept to the other party? How do you usually get a standing neutral in place?
Well, both parties do need to decide on it. They would interview their standing neutral, right? So we want to make sure they're comfortable with it. They need to make sure they're unbiased. There is, again, in the white paper, we offer up what the process is and how you would actually bring in those standing neutrals. Sometimes it is one party saying, gosh, I've heard this works really well. I've read an article on it, and now maybe they've read a white paper, and they're bringing this knowledge of a new management technique that they haven't used to the other party. Now, we personally at the University of Tennessee see most of the use of the standing neutral way up front in the deal creation process. Okay. We call them actually certified deal architects. So we're teaching people how to design these neutrals, how to help parties design win-win vested relationships. And it is a neutral role. Right? So you don't work for the buyer, you don't work for the supplier, you work for both parties. And it's more of a facilitation role, right? So I'm facilitating the parties to articulate what they want, help them not go down a path of typical negotiation, but true win-win design of their relationship and contract.
So where would you actually look for them? Are you looking at folks who may be traditional mediators, lawyers, or are you looking for folks who are perhaps more commercially focused? It may even be ex-procurement or contract managers. Who makes a good standing neutral?
That's a great question. There's really no right answer. We've seen it all. We've seen lawyers, we've seen non-lawyers, we've seen people who were professional mediators come in and play that, consultants. So up front in the very early stages of a deal, when you're doing the deal creation, we do see some lawyers in there, but we see more business people, respected business people. We've seen an example for in one of the cases that we have, the examples in the white paper, it was actually a college dean, right in the construction industry. So they brought in a respected person that all the parties agree to would be helpful in helping them, work through their relationship and make it better. It is paid for by both players, right? So that's important. It is not funded by one or the other. It is funded by both.
Yeah, they've not got a bias one way or the other, which obviously, leads to the trust in the decision. So would they make a decision as a a traditional dispute resolution forum? You may have somebody who makes a decision that's binding, or is it more of an advisory position that can kind of say, hey, I think that that's unfair, or I think that maybe you're looking at this in the wrong way, and just tries to bring the parties together when there's some differences of opinion. But of course, I want to be clear, it's not just all about disputes. It's about making sure everyone's set up to succeed in the first place.
Yeah, that's correct. They can make recommendations. They can even make binding recommendations, but that's a power that the parties give them. Mm-hmm. So when they engage their standing neutral, they're going to actually write up a short contract, a one-page contract with them, to say, here's your role, here's your authorities, here's your expectations. So in some of the examples that we've given, they do give binding, give the standing neutral power of a binding resolution. But the beauty of it is by having the neutral, they don't go into conflict because they've actually solved and talked through things when they're small. Yeah. We get into conflict because we get positioned and we aren't looking at all of exactly. Yeah. We're not as transparent and we're not actually solving the problem in an effective way. So the standing neutral, for our perspective, really is to keep you out of conflict and in harmony and in continual alignment. But you're right, if you do have a true conflict, now you don't have to go to a mediator or an arbitrator because you've given that standing neutral the right to do that. Mm-hmm. You don't have to, right? So if you could say, gosh, standing neutral, we agree to disagree, I want to go to an arbitrator, absolutely fine. That's something you design into your standing neutral process. Yeah. You, as the parties, have the control to decide how you're using them.
Now, I know that something you advocate for is kind of commercial transparency, pricing, cost model transparency between both the parties for these most important commercial relationships. Would it be the role of a standing neutral to essentially validate numbers, input costs, things like that one party has suggested to another so that the other party has a trust behind them, or do they not get involved in kind of that level of the conversation?
Again, it depends on what authority and responsibilities you've given, but we have seen that actually in a large outsourcing deal and complex pricing and cost structures. We had a large consulting company was playing that role up front during the deal making to validate those costs for that pricing model. We've also seen it. This is a really interesting example. In a couple of cases in outsourcing deals, the standing neutral validated the performance scores. Right. So you have a scorecard in a performance-based deal. So the supplier has to perform a certain level of performance in order to not get a penalty or in order to get an incentive. And so the standing neutral is the one coming in saying, here's what the score is. It's not the buyer says, this is what you did. This is what your score is. And the supplier going, no, I scored higher, right? They're always going to have a difference of opinion. So they've given their authority for that scorecard to the standing neutral. Mm-hmm. Stunning results in terms of keeping harmony because they trust the other, they trust the third party as well. I guess that's the score. Yeah. It's not, I have a bad feeling because you scored me too low, or, you always think you're too high if you're the supplier.
Now, would you see or anticipate times when a standing neutral plays a role while the trust is forming between a relationship, and then their role perhaps lessens as trust is built between the parties? Or do you recommend that they're present for ultimately the entire relationship?
Great question. So here's one of the reasons why we wanted to write the white paper. We're seeing a lot of emphasis on the standing neutral up front during the contracting process to keep you in harmony, that win-win. Instead of negotiating, you're still focusing on the alignment and getting that contract aligned in a win-win way. And that's what we teach at the University of Tennessee with our certified architect. But that role is so valuable that we want to see it continued, but in a much lesser way. You don't need them after post-contract signing very often. Maybe it's once a month in your monthly reviews or once a quarter. But we want to see that continuation. And it's super interesting because the companies that have applied a standing neutral in the form of a certified architect up front, they're so happy with the relationship. They go, well, why would we ever need somebody after the fact? We're great. This is the best we've ever had. But people change. Business changes, right? In these complex deals, change is the norm, and it's very easy to get out of alignment. And new players come in town. So we have to keep the relationship and the contract in continual alignment of interest. So we want to see that all the way through to the end. You know, in the construction industry, as we mentioned, they don't do anything up front, and it's all on the back end around proactive dispute resolution. So don't wait for it to get to a dispute. We're going to have our dispute review board be part of your governance. And it's been super effective, but they don't do it during the deal process. So the concept of having this neutral can be anywhere in your relationship. And we advocate that you use one throughout the life of the relationship, up front, all the way to the very end. But the role is unique and it changes based on your needs.
You know, having I've had the opportunity in my career to both buy outsourcing services and deliver them. And I don't think I can remember one contract that the needs of the buying entity didn't change, you know, mid-contract. You enter into these 3, 4, 5, sometimes 7+ year deals, and they're never going to look the same at the end of it than the beginning. But where they fail, at least in my experience, is when, you know, there's this kind of interest on one party to try and maintain the status quo. And it's usually the selling side where maybe they want to keep the total contract value, or whatever reason it may be, there's a little less flexibility. And so many times those deals just end up in, you know, bad will and failure, and they don't deliver on their promise. And I can only imagine the value to some of those relationships that I've seen fail, to having a standing neutral, to keeping everybody on target and to keep things moving and to keep, you know, flexibility in the deal, because one side often doesn't see the changing requirements of the other side until it's too late.
Right. And the standing neutral is there to point it out. It's not us versus them, buyer, supplier. They're an expert in the industry in what you're doing, right? And they are that trusted advisor for both to put a little reality check into the positions that people get into.
So you mentioned that in the white paper you'd talked through a few different case studies. I know you've mentioned a couple of examples of kind of real life examples of where a standing neutral has been used and the benefits of bringing those. But I wonder if there's any other case studies that just jump out at you that you'd like to share that really show the breadth of ways that a standing neutral can add value to, you know, to your important relationships.
Yeah, in the paper, we actually outlined 12 examples, all the way from pre-contract signing in the use of a certified deal architect, as I mentioned, you know, bringing in someone right up front, all the way to the far end of kind of a dispute resolution contract where they're actually doing binding decisions. So let me give a couple of examples. One is Telia. Telia is a Swedish telco, so think of AT&T or Verizon for Sweden, and their supplier Veolia for tech maintenance of their 16,000 tech sites. So they've got, you know, cell towers and caves and tunnels and all over the country. So they worked with EY and Serio law firm as a neutral. So they brought them in to help them architect and facilitate their partnership, not only through pre-contract signing, but through the transition itself, right? So you've got all this transition. They had going from 20 suppliers down to Telia as the partner. So they brought them in that upfront piece, right? You've got another example that we profile, an outsourcing example, where the standing neutral is managing the scorecard on behalf. So you don't get this tit for tat back and forth. A really fun example is from the real estate industry, where they had what they called standing arbitrators. So sometimes you can give your standing neutral the ability to be a binding arbitrator. And in this case, they did. And it was a super complex construction project with lots of moving parts. And so the standing arbitrator became part of the team. And when they agreed to disagree, they said, you standing neutral. We trust you. You make the decision, because the cost of the delay of the construction project, would have been horrible in terms of time and cost and negative energy and goodwill. So they've brought them in not only to control the dispute, right, up front proactively. So they're part of the construction project team, but they also went all the way into binding arbitration.
Yeah,
which is, so that's, again,
it's kind of fascinating. You have like a judge. It's like a judge on the project team who is there to essentially, is focused on the outcomes, the desired outcomes that both parties have agreed is important to them and they want to achieve, and helping them maximize their chances of doing that.
Yeah, another example that we saw was in the nonprofit industry, where they have what's called the Wise Persons Committee. And this Wise Persons Committee, when there's disagreements among all the different countries that participate in the nonprofit, right? Because the nonprofits in all these different countries. So when they have disagreements between the different countries and entities, they have a group called Wise Persons, and the Wise Persons is like a peer group. Right. So these peers come and help their peers solve their problems. So there's no right or wrong answer. Is it one person? Is it three people? It has to be an odd number, right? Because if you have 4 or 2, you could be split. So it has to be one. It has to be neutral. It has to be picked by both parties. And in addition to the numbers, you'll decide if you're going to use them pre-contract, post-contract, or even give them the power of mediation or arbitration. And if they are a professional arbitrator, you can do that. Obviously, if they're a consultant and they're not an arbitrator, they're not. You shouldn't give them those, bequeath with them those types of skills. So it's fun, So by studying all these different ways and usage, you can really see that the concept pops. Right? It's like, wow, this really is not something new the University of Tennessee's made up. It's out there in the industry today, being used in different ways, but not being embraced in a strategic way, in a thoughtful way, holistically for relationships.
So how, you're working with procurement and commercial teams on both sides of a deal, delivery teams as well. And, they're used to this idea of having control, obviously over their side of the relationship, and bringing in a standing neutral in some regards, especially when you're starting to give binding powers to those standing neutrals, can feel like it's giving up control, and you have, you're kind of at the mercy of somebody else. And yes, you've agreed who that person is, and you've agreed the rules of engagement, but it's still a changing role for the internal folks. So I'm interested, how have you seen procurement or commercial teams respond when there is a standing neutral in a relationship, and maybe even any tips to, help that go as well as possible of integrating that standing neutral into the team?
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons why we wrote the white paper, is because we see a lot of barriers. We suggested up front, we haven't had a lot of trouble with getting people to see the rationale of bringing in a deal architect up front, right? And we've had lots of good traction with that, but we want them to continue with that role after the fact. And we do get a lot of barriers. It's a great relationship. Oh, we don't need that. We'll just use an arbitrator. Why aren't we using the existing ways that we've done? And so in the paper, there's a whole section, an appendix, we call it barrier busting, and it's all the reasons why we've seen and heard people not want to use a standing neutral.
Yeah.
And it's never cost, because the cost is
it's like negligible, right, compared to the value that's on the table.
Exactly. But it's just that it's different, and people are afraid of it. And by sharing these different examples in practice, we're hoping to open up the eyes of businesses that this isn't new. This isn't different. You may not be doing it, but it's worked. Some of the case studies that we have, they're named companies in here. And you can see how effective it is. And I think it's just really educating people of the art of the possible. I mean, you're the art of procurement, right? So we have to educate people of the art of the possible.
That's what we're all about, inspiring people to think differently and to look at different ways to approach, existing challenges that they may have. And so my final question is, for anybody who's listening today, they are really interested in this concept of a standing neutral. They'd like to learn a little bit more, figure out how they should get started, or, have a look at some of those case study examples that you provided. Where would be the best place for them to go and do that?
Well, the University of Tennessee has a dedicated research library to the vested movement and win-win collaborative relationship. So the website is www.vestedway.com. And if you go up, there's a resource library. Just go hit the library. All of our white papers and case studies are free. You just download them.
Yep.
They're also all open source, which means that if you download them, you can share them. So take it back. If you've got a corporate share site, you can put it on your share site. The Art of Procurement, you've got a resource center, right?
Yep.
Go ahead and stick it on your resource center. The goal is to make knowledge accessible. And without knowledge, we're not going to do and be challenged to change, to do more modern, progressive things. So as I say, share shamelessly. Go out, download, and share. It is under the Creative Commons license. So go for it. Go and share the concept, because it's folks like you and your listeners who are going to change the world one deal at a time for a better place.
Well, I'm going to include the links to Vested Way and to the white paper itself in our show notes for today's episodes, and listeners can find those just by going to artofprocurement.com/podcast, and you'll be able to search and see this podcast amongst all the pods that we have up on the site. I'm also actually, as you mentioned, Kate, we have a resource center now on Art of Procurement, so I'm going to include this in our resource center, so anyone can go straight there as well. That's just going to be artofprocurement.com/resources. Download the paper. Kate, it's always a pleasure welcoming you onto Art of Procurement. It feels like it's been too long since we did something, so I'm delighted that you're able to come and join me today and just share the ideas around standing neutrals.
Well, so fun to share with your audience. You've got progressive folks out there, and those are the ones that we try to reach and share our information with. So have fun, and thanks a lot.
Thanks. Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.